this episode of the G4 Sumobot series, we're going to finish off our motor mounting plate. We're going to start by adding some holes for screws that we will use to hold the plate down onto the Sumobot body. We also need to add pockets to the Sumobot body so that the screws don't break apart the plastic. We'll also be adding 2 holes for attaching the Tamiya gearbox to the motor mounting plate. And finally, we'll be adding some weight cavities so that we can increase the weight of our Sumobot on the silicone wheels to give us more traction during the Sumobot fight. Before we get to that, we have to take care of one unfinished piece of business with our motor mounting plate. In our last episode, we set the width of our plate to 116 millimeters. We're going to drop that down to 115.5. That'll give us 0.5 millimeter of leeway, and so we shouldn't have much in the way of friction when we try to push these 2 pieces together after they've been printed out on the 3D printer. To begin with, we're going to add the screw holes to the motor mounting plate, and we're going to add the pockets to the Sumobot body. Center your 3D cursor and create a mesh. You can do this through Shift-A or going up to the Add menu. We're going to set the dimensions of the cylinder for our motor plate, our front right screw, to a X width of 2, a Y width of 2, and a Z length of 19. And we're going to move this first pin. We're going to move this to 35.5 on X, 4.5 on Y, and 7.5 on Z. Now that places this pin here in this corner. Now we're going to be placing a cavity for a weight in this corner. We're going to place one here on the right and one on the left as well. So we're going to want another one of these pins in the symmetrical corner over here. Easiest way to do that is to make sure that you have the pin selected. So you've got a gold outline on the pin. Shift D to duplicate the pin. Press Escape to keep the pin in its current spot. We're going to use the Move gizmo. We can drag this over to here, but we're just moving it onto the symmetrical side of the Y-axis here, so we're going to be moving it just along the X-axis, which means that we're going to be moving it to a position of negative 35.5. So we can just do that, negative 35.5, and there we have our next pin. Now we want 2 more pins, one here and one here. So we're going to duplicate this pin again. So Shift D to duplicate, Escape to keep it in its current spot. And I'm going to move it generally where I want it. We're going to move it in about right here, and we're going to make sure that we're going to tighten up its location here. So we're going to set X to negative 30. We're going to set Y to 52.1, and we're going to keep Z at 7.5. And when we look at this from a top view, and we'll just go into the X-ray mode. We can go Shift Z to get into X-ray mode. It's a little bit hard to see, but we're approximately right in the center of this tab, which is where we want to be. And we're going to create a pin on the other side over here. So Shift D, Escape, grab it, and we're going to be moving it to positive 30. Position of positive 30, so we can move it. Let's just come up here, tweak that, positive 30. So now we have our pins that we're going to use to create pockets in the Sumobot body. Let's join them up Or let's group them up and join them into a single group. So I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to left click on all 4 of my pins in order. And then under here, I want to join them. So under Object, Join, or just press Ctrl J. I'm going to rename these and I'm going to call them, I'll call them motor plate screws. To add these pockets to the Sumobot body, select the Sumobot body. Then over here in the modifiers panel, select Boolean. From your object list, find the motor plate screws. And then we're going to apply this Boolean operation like so. Right now we're going to hide the motor plate screws. And we can see that we now have 2mm screw pockets added to our Sumobot. We're going to add these same holes now to our motor mounting plate. So we're going to bring up the motor plate. Here it is. We can see this is where the motor mounting screw holes are going to be. Let's select the plate and repeat the same Boolean operation that we did. Select our motor plate screws and apply that. We can hide the motor screws. And now we have the screw holes in our motor mounting plate. Next, we're going to add 2 holes for the motor mounting bolts. These are 3mm bolts. So let's add a cylinder. So Shift A creates a cylinder. And we're going to make sure that we've got a nice round hole. So 32 vertices will make a nice round hole. We're going to set the dimensions to 3.2 for the diameter on the X and Y. And we're going to set the length of this pin to 10mm. We're going to move this now to 29.5 on X, 28.5 on Y, and we will center it. Well, thereabouts. This puts our first pin for the right-hand side of our motor here, and we're going to duplicate this. So Shift D to duplicate it, Escape to hold the pin in place. And this pin is simply going to sit on the other side, so it's symmetrical on the Y-axis here. So we'll set it to negative 29.5 for X, and that puts the pin on the other side. Now these pin positions were determined by measuring where the Tamiya gearbox was going to be sitting on the motor mounting plate, and then making sure that the screw holes were exactly where the mounting loops on the Tamiya gearbox would be. I'm going to right now group both of these pins into one object. So I'm going to Shift select the other pin, and I'm going to do a Control J to make them into a single group. I'm going to rename these to motor mount screws. And now I'm going to perform a Boolean operation to add those holes into the motor mounting plate. So select the motor mounting plate. From the modifiers tab, choose Boolean. Select our motor mount screws and apply them. So now we've got 3.2mm diameter holes for the bolts that will hold the Tamiya gearbox onto the motor mounting plate. And we've got 4 smaller 2mm screw holes to hold the motor mounting plate onto the Sumobot body. We're going to hide the motor mounting plate for right now. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add the cavities for the weights that we're going to add to the Sumobot body. Now we want to have a little weight added to our Sumobot because when we're in a pushing match with another robot, we want to have as much traction on our wheels as possible, and adding a little weight to our Sumobot body will help us with that. Now, we want a weight that is easily accessible and doesn't cost much. And when we're testing our Sumobots, we end up with a lot of spent AA cells. And so what better thing to use as weight on our Sumobot than these dead batteries? A typical battery is 14.5 millimeters across the narrow end and approximately 51 millimeters tip to tip. So we're going to use that measurement and create a pocket to hold these batteries. Begin by adding a cube. Shift A to select a cube. And we're going to set the cube to a dimension of 15 millimeters by 52 millimeters by 20 millimeters. And we want to position this off to the left-hand side. So let's set the location to negative 45.5, negative 20.5, and 7.5. So this is going to be our first pocket. Now this pocket is going to be deep enough to hold a single AA cell. If you wanted to increase the amount of weight that your Sumobot had, you would add an additional 15 millimeters or an additional 14.5 millimeters in the Z direction, and that would give you a pocket big enough to hold 2 AA batteries. We're going to make these pockets just hold a single AA battery. So by the time we're done, we will increase the weight of our Sumobot by 3 AA batteries. Now we're going to create a second pocket on the other side here, symmetrical across the y-axis. So Shift D to duplicate, Escape to keep the block in place. And we're going to modify its X position. So it's going to become 45.5. And that will put the block on the other side. And we want one for the middle. So Shift D to duplicate, Escape to keep it in place. And we're going to rotate it on the Z-axis. So let's rotate it by 90 degrees. And let's set its X position to 0. That centers it at the front. And we will set its Y position to negative 39. And this takes and places the block so that the front face is in line with the other front faces on the other pockets. We're going to group these together into a single object. So Shift click the other blocks and Control J to join them. And now select the Sumobot body from the modifier, grab Boolean. And we're gonna rename our cavities here. So I'm going to rename these weight cavity. And so back to the Sumobot body, I'm going to select that from the object list. And I had to scroll down to find it. It was just hidden off the bottom of the list there. And I will apply. Now I'm going to hide those blocks. And so now we have space in our Sumobot to place 3 AA batteries to increase the weight of our Sumobot. And increasing the depth of those pockets would allow you to increase the number of batteries that you're holding inside the Sumobot. The last thing that we're going to do is build a cable hole to contain the electrical wires that are going to run our Tamiya motors. Create a cylinder. And we're going to give the cylinder a radius of 3.125. So we have a piece of plastic air hose that we're using to pick the wire up off the Sumobot body. And so the diameter for this particular hole is based on the piece of air hose tubing that we're using on our Sumobot body. So if you're just running a wire down to your Tamiya gearbox and you're not elevating the wire above the Sumobot, which is useful to keep the wire from getting tangled up during the competition. Then set the diameter of this cylinder to something that more closely matches the width of the wires that you're using. So diameter of 6.25 millimeters works really good for us here. We're going to set the length of this now to 25 millimeters. And we're going to set the position here. We're going to keep it centered at 0 on X. And we're going to move it to 49.5 on Y. And we're going to bring it down to 42 on Z. And that'll push it right through to the top of the Sumobot and have it pull out through the bottom. We'll call this one the cable hole. And now select the Sumobot body in the modifiers panel, bring up a Boolean, select the cable hole, and apply the Boolean operation. Now we have a hole for our wires, and specifically a hole that we can use for pushing through the plastic air tube hose that we're using. That's about it for this episode. In the next episode, we will work on building wheels for our Sumobot, and we'll also do a little branding on our Sumobot. We'll add some text to the back to personalize it.